Iron Bottom Sound, November 14th, 1942. Mirror 47 hours. The sea is black glass, broken only by the faint shimmer of phosphorescence around a speeding hull. Inside the battleship, red lights bathe the Combat Information Center. Men whisper coordinates. Radar scopes glow like distant suns. On the surface, her great turrets begin to traverse. Slow, deliberate, mechanical muscle against the Pacific night. No moon, no searchlights. Just bearings, ranges, and trust. Through the darkness, Japanese warships approach in tight formation. Veterans of countless night engagements. They believe they own the dark. For months they have ruled it. But tonight, the rules are different. A calm voice cuts the tension. Target acquired. Electricity hums. Salvos thunder. The night explodes into orange blossoms of fire. Metal tears. In 9 minutes, a naval tradition older than both fleets collapses beneath radar-directed fury. When silence returns, the Pacific smells of burning oil and cordite. A single American battleship has rewritten the meaning of night combat. Her name, USS Washington. By the late summer of 1942, the world's oceans had become laboratories of destruction. The Pacific, once vast and serene, was now a chessboard of coral, steel, and blood. The Japanese Empire still stretched from the jungles of Burma to the outer islands of the Central Pacific. But in the wake of Midway, the tide had begun to shift, subtly, not yet decisively. Guadalcanal was the test. An obscure island in the Solomons, it offered one thing that could tilt an entire war: an airfield. Henderson Field. Whoever held it controlled the sea lanes between America's bases in the South Pacific and the Empire's defensive perimeter. For both sides, that meant everything. From August onward, the island became a nightmare of endurance. Marines clung to muddy foxholes while destroyers and cruisers dueled offshore almost every night. The Japanese, masters of night surface combat, called their supply convoys the Tokyo Express. They ran under moonlight and rain squalls, bringing men and shells to crush the American foothold. In those months, the U.S. Navy was learning the hard way. At Savo Island, 4 Allied cruisers were torn apart in minutes. At Cape Esperance, both sides staggered away bloodied, victory ambiguous. Even after Midway, Japan's long, sleek destroyers and veteran night crews ruled the darkness. American ships, burdened with older doctrine and poor coordination, fought half-blind. Yet within that struggle, something was quietly changing. The U.S. Navy had begun to perfect a weapon unseen by the enemy's naked eye: radar. The SG Surface Search Set, only recently installed aboard the newest battleships, could read a steel hull beyond visual range, even in total blackness. To the Japanese, who still relied on optics and star shells, it was sorcery. But radar alone wasn't enough. Commanders had to believe in it. Doctrine had to evolve. That evolution came slowly, one desperate engagement at a time. By November, the stakes were existential. If Henderson Field fell, every man on Guadalcanal would die, or retreat into the jungle. And with them would go the hope of holding the South Pacific. Admiral William F. Halsey knew it. So did Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee, an analytical, calm Kentuckian with the soul of a gunnery instructor. In early November, Halsey's battered fleet was in crisis. Carriers were gone for repairs. Cruisers were depleted. Destroyers were dying faster than they could be replaced. Only 2 modern battleships remained intact: USS Washington and USS South Dakota. Lee had them both. Together they formed the core of Task Force 64, a small, hastily assembled surface group charged with an impossible mission: defend the approaches to Guadalcanal from yet another major Japanese bombardment. The enemy plan was straightforward and terrifying. Battleship Kirishima, veteran of Pearl Harbor escorted by cruisers and destroyers, would steam down the slot to obliterate Henderson Field with high explosive fire. Behind her, transport convoys waited to land reinforcements. It was a script the Japanese had written before, and one that had worked. But this time, waiting in the shadows, an American battleship would fight on her own terms. That battleship, USS Washington, was no museum relic of World War I. She was new, commissioned only the previous year, faster, heavier, and guided by a technology the enemy couldn't yet comprehend. Her crew had trained relentlessly in radar gunnery and battle damage drills. Her captain, Glenn B. Davis, was precise, disciplined, and utterly loyal to Admiral Lee's doctrine. Shoot first, shoot accurately, and never reveal your position until it's too late. By November 14, 1942, the island's airfield was under constant attack. Japanese shells had already scarred the runways. Each night, men watched the horizon for the flash of enemy guns. The Marines called the waters around the island Iron Bottom Sound, for the dozens of ships already resting beneath it. Now, another night loomed. Reports from scouts suggested a fresh bombardment force was inbound. The last American surface ships capable of stopping it were preparing to sail from Espiritu Santo. Engines rumbled. Ammunition trains clattered. Crews took their stations. Somewhere deep within Washington's armored citadel, radar men adjusted dials and plotted bearings across glowing screens. The coming hours would decide whether Guadalcanal lived or died. And for one battleship, they would determine whether history remembered her at all. USS Washington was a product of design evolution and wartime necessity, a blend of treaty-era restraint and industrial audacity. Laid down in 1938 at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, she embodied the second of the North Carolina-class battleships, the first modern American capital ships built after 2 decades of stagnation. Her sleek profile concealed a fortress. 9 16-inch guns housed in triple turrets, 12-inch belt armor, and a top speed exceeding 27 knots. To the untrained eye, she was merely another battleship. To those who served aboard, she was a new breed, fast enough to escort carriers, strong enough to fight alone, and sophisticated enough to fight blind. The Washington was the first to receive the SG radar system, a surface search marvel that could detect ships beyond the horizon and feed precise range and bearing data directly into her fire control computers. This was not theory. It was revolution in steel, yet as revolutionary as she was, she remained untested. Her gunners drilled daily, firing at towed targets in the open Pacific. Her engineers obsessed over calibration tables and recoil harmonics. The crew learned to fight by instruments, by invisible signatures instead of moonlit silhouettes. They were preparing for a kind of battle no Navy had ever truly fought. Their commander, Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, was the perfect man for this turning point. A quiet, deliberate officer, Lee had been a pistol champion in his youth, a man of uncanny precision and patience. He believed in radar the way others believed in instinct. His philosophy was simple. The first accurate salvo decides the fight, but he also understood responsibility. He knew his 2 battleships were all Halsey had left to guard Guadalcanal. Losing them would mean catastrophe. And so, when the orders came to intercept the Japanese bombardment force on the night of November 14th, Lee prepared his ships not for glory, but for survival. The Japanese task force approaching from the north was led by Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, an experienced officer commanding a formidable line. The battlecruiser Kirishima, heavy cruisers Otago and Takao, and a screen of destroyers hardened by countless night missions. They had trained for years in torpedo tactics, with the deadly Type 93 Long Lance giving them unmatched striking range. Their optics were superb, their discipline absolute. But they did not yet know that American radar had changed the equation. Lee organized Task Force 64 into a loose formation, Washington leading, South Dakota trailing several thousand yards astern, flanked by destroyers Walke, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. These destroyers were brave but expendable. Their job was to scout ahead, detect the enemy, and, if necessary, die doing it. At dusk, the sea turned iron gray. Both American battleships ran dark, radar silently sweeping the void ahead. In their plotting rooms, officers traced lines across transparent plotting tables, predicting where Kondo's ships would emerge from the northern channels. Every man aboard knew what was at stake. If the Japanese reached the island, they would pound Henderson Field into useless dust. The next morning, waves of bombers from Rabaul would finish the job. Hours passed. The ocean whispered. Below decks, men waited beside shell hoists and ammunition racks, sweat glistening on their necks despite the cool air. Some wrote short notes, folded them into pockets. Others simply stared at the bulkheads, listening to the heartbeat of the ship. Shortly before midnight, radar screens flickered. Contacts. Distant, faint, but real. Washington's operators reported multiple large returns approaching from the northwest. Admiral Lee's voice remained calm as he plotted the intercept. The destroyers surged forward. This was the moment radar doctrine was meant for. No searchlights, no flares, no visual confirmation. Only the ghostly blips on glowing scopes and the mathematical precision of trained men. At 16 hours, Washington's radar locked onto a major target, the Japanese flagship Atago. Lee held fire. The destroyers ahead were about to collide with the enemy vanguard. Within minutes, explosions ripped the night apart as Walkie and Preston took torpedo hits and vanished in pillars of flame. Benham was crippled. Gwynn fell back, her gun still firing blindly into the black. Through the smoke and chaos, South Dakota pressed on, until a circuit overload darkened her ship from bridge to stern. In an instant, she became a glowing silhouette under Japanese searchlights, drawing every gun in the enemy formation. Tracers raked her superstructure. Shells tore through radar and radio. Amid this inferno, one ship remained unseen, silent, invisible, and deadly. Washington glided southward, radar intact, crew unshaken. On her plotting tables, the position of the Kirishima appeared, closing fast. Lee knew the decision he was about to make would not just save Guadalcanal, it would redefine surface warfare itself. And with that, the darkness prepared to explode into history. Angles, Section 11. The human angle inside. The armored heart of Washington, the men lived in a rhythm of steel and ritual. For months, they had trained not for parades, but for seconds of perfect coordination. A battleship was a living organism, 1,500 men breathing as one machine. Each had a function, each a place in the symphony of battle. When battle stations sounded on that November night, no one shouted. Orders came soft, clipped, deliberate. Men slid into their stations, strapped on helmets, and adjusted gas masks that fogged with each breath. The red emergency lights gave every face a ghostly pallor. Gunners checked breech locks. Powder handlers moved in pairs, lifting silk bags of cordite through metal doors. The air below decks was hot and metallic, filled with the thrum of turbines. Above, in the director tower, officers leaned over rangefinders and radar repeaters. They had no visual target, no star shells, only faith in the unseen. Many of these sailors were young, 19, 20, maybe 22. Some had joined after Pearl Harbor, their father's generation telling them battleships were obsolete. But in this moment, they were about to prove that steel and discipline could still dominate a sea ruled by fire and machines. No one aboard Washington saw the Japanese ships until it was over. They felt them, through vibration, through shouted reports from the Combat Information Center, through the shifting tone of the ship's heartbeat as engines turned for attack speed. For these men, the darkness was not fear, it was focus. When the guns finally spoke, they felt the entire ship recoil, like a living creature striking back after being silent too long. The technological angle USS Washington was more than firepower. She was a node of early electronic warfare, the first American battleship to fuse radar detection with real-time gunnery computation. Her SG radar could detect a destroyer-sized target at more than 30,000 yards, and her Mark 8 fire control system could translate that into gun elevation and bearing within seconds. Before radar, night battles were chaos, determined by luck, flares, and eyesight. In the Pacific, the Japanese had mastered that art. Their night optics were unmatched, their torpedoes lethal at ranges beyond visual reach. But radar changed the equation entirely. It turned the darkness from enemy into ally. The Washington's radar team worked like mathematicians under pressure. Seaman technicians adjusted gain and sweep frequency, ensuring returns were clear. The Combat Information Center, or CIC, became the ship's brain, glowing with faint green light, plotting enemy movements on translucent boards. They could see ships that no lookout could. That night, Washington tracked Kirishima before Kirishima even knew she was being hunted. Data flowed from radar to the Mark 8 analog computer, which solved the range rate problem in real time. The solution, range 8,400 yards, bearing steady target speed 25 knots, appeared on the gunnery display. The big guns slewed silently into position. To the outside world, the Washington was invisible. No searchlights, no signal lamps. Only the low hum of her turbines as she turned to deliver a perfect broadside. This was the moment where 20th century warfare crossed a line. The human eye was no longer the master of battle. Machines could now see through darkness, calculate death in seconds, and strike without warning. Radar didn't just give Washington an advantage, it made her the prototype of every future naval combatant, from missile cruisers to Aegis destroyers. And yet, for all that technology, it still came down to human fingers pressing triggers and human hearts believing in the unseen echo of an approaching enemy. The tactical angle Rear Admiral Willis Lee's tactics that night were a masterclass in restraint and timing. He understood that technology without discipline meant nothing. Lee kept Washington dark and silent. He refused to open fire when radar first confirmed the Japanese line, to avoid revealing position and preserve the element of surprise. He allowed the destroyers to charge ahead, knowing their sacrifice would expose the enemy's formation and light the tactical picture. It was brutal logic, but necessary. When South Dakota's power failure turned her into a burning target, Lee didn't panic. He saw opportunity. Every enemy gun now focused on her, while Washington remained undetected off the flank. He ordered his helmsman to turn slightly southward, positioning Washington for a clear line of fire on Kirishima. His CIC confirmed range and bearing. Gunnery teams were already tracking. Lee waited until he had full radar solution. Not partial, not visual, but mathematically perfect. When the order finally came, open fire, it wasn't emotion, it was calculation. 9 16-inch rifles thundered at once. Each shell weighed over a ton and left the barrels at 2,300 feet per second. The first salvo straddled the target. The second walked closer. The third found home. Within minutes, Kirishima was bleeding flame. Her rudder jammed, her hull riven by shell fire that no armor could withstand. This was not luck. It was doctrine, the marriage of technology, discipline, and timing. Lee had turned a chaotic night melee into a controlled execution. For the first time in history, a battleship had destroyed another battleship entirely by radar fire. And that moment was only the beginning. Angles, Section 24. The enemy angle. To understand the magnitude of Washington's victory, one must first understand the men on the other side of the guns. The Imperial Japanese Navy's night surface forces were not reckless. They were elite. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo commanded with confidence, built from years of dominance in night warfare. His ships, Kirishima, Atago, Takao, and their destroyers, had trained endlessly in coordinated torpedo attacks under cover of darkness. They trusted their Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, whose range and explosive power dwarfed anything the Allies possessed. Japanese doctrine was visual. It relied on the human eye, the discipline of lookouts, and the synchronization of gunnery officers reading optical rangefinders under moonlight. Their combat efficiency in the first year of the Pacific War was unmatched, but in that November night off Guadalcanal, their strength became their weakness. They couldn't see the enemy that saw them. They couldn't strike what was already striking back from beyond vision. When South Dakota appeared lit by fire, The Japanese gunners believed they had found their victim. Their shells walked up her decks with deadly precision. They focused everything on that single burning ship, unaware that another giant was stalking them through the blackness. When Washington's radar-directed salvos began, the Japanese reaction was disbelief. The shells came from nowhere. No flares, no searchlights, no warning. Kirishima's hull convulsed under the impacts. Her rudder locked hard over, spinning her in helpless circles. Crews tried to return fire, but by the time they found direction, the next salvo landed. To the Japanese officers on the bridge, it must have felt like divine punishment. A ghost ship, unseen and unerring, destroying them with mathematical precision. For decades, Japan had built its navy on honor and visibility, on the warrior's eye, the duelist's engagement. That night, radar shattered that philosophy. The future had arrived, and it came wrapped in silence. The leadership angle. Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee was not a man of theatrics. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. He trusted data. Throughout the battle, he stood calmly behind his radar and fire control officers, reading solutions like a teacher grading perfect math. Every decision he made that night reflected his balance of intellect and instinct. He chose to engage at the moment when surprise was total. He chose not to switch on searchlights even when other ships begged for visual contact. He chose to preserve radio silence except for the simplest commands. Each of these choices violated old-school naval instinct. But Lee wasn't fighting the past. He was defining the future. Even after Kirishima was crippled and burning, Lee refused to press recklessly. He kept Washington moving, always changing course, always mindful of unseen torpedoes. His goal was not destruction for its own sake, it was control. When asked later how he maintained composure, Lee replied simply, "We knew what the instruments were telling us." That quiet confidence made him one of the few flag officers who bridged the age of battleships into the electronic era. His command style would echo decades later in the doctrines of missile-age warfare. Trust your sensors, trust your data, strike first, and disappear before the enemy can answer. On that November night, under pressure and chaos, Lee didn't just save a fleet. He proved that leadership could evolve faster than tradition. The moral and strategic angle. There is something haunting about the Battle of Guadalcanal's final surface engagement. It wasn't fought for glory. It was fought to keep a single airstrip alive, a muddy runway that symbolized the Pacific's balance of power. In less than an hour, Washington changed the trajectory of that campaign. Her radar-guided gunfire silenced Kirishima, shattered Kondo's confidence, and forced the Japanese fleet to withdraw. The transports carrying troops for the final assault on Henderson Field scattered. Many were bombed and sunk the next morning by American aircraft. The cost in lives was immense on both sides. Hundreds of sailors went into the dark water that night, their ships burning above them. The sea around Guadalcanal was already graveyard enough to earn its name, Iron Bottom Sound. But in the broader context of war, Washington's triumph revealed a sobering truth: that mastery of technology could now eclipse courage itself. The most skilled sailors, the most disciplined crews, the most experienced admirals could be undone by invisible waves pulsing through the air. For some, this marked progress. For others, it marked the end of an age, the passing of the romantic warrior's duel into an era of silent, data-driven annihilation. Still within that silence lay something profoundly human: the resolve of men who refused to falter. The Japanese fought to the last shell. The Americans fought with precision and restraint. Both believed they were upholding honor in their own way. And when the smoke cleared, both sides knew the world of naval warfare had changed forever. The Pacific was no longer ruled by who saw first, but by who understood first. From that night onward, Washington would carry an invisible reputation. A ship that had fought perfectly, then faded into the margins of history. But her greatest test, her defining hour, was still unfolding in the darkness of Iron Bottom Sound. Climax. Turning point. Part 100, 25 hours. The night is chaos. South Dakota burns, her superstructure scarred by high explosive fire, her radio rooms silenced. Japanese shells trace fiery arcs across the sky, searching for the source of the earlier radar blips. Every gun in Kondo's formation now focuses on that single, wounded silhouette. Amid the roar, Washington glides unseen. She runs dark, her radar eyes open, her crew steady. The bridge hums with low voices and the clatter of typewriters marking bearings. Every man aboard knows. If they reveal themselves too soon, they die. In the Combat Information Center, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Hooper reports the latest range data. A large contact, bearing 320 degrees true, distance 8,400 yards, closing fast. The echo is steady. No course change. Admiral Lee studies the plot. "That's our battleship," he says quietly. Target confirmed. Kirishima. On the plotting board, the enemy's path cuts across Washington's bow like an approaching shadow. Lee doesn't hesitate. "Come right to 210. Hold fire until you have solution." The order ripples through compartments, passed down in calm precision. Inside Turret 1, Commander Glenn Davis's gunnery teams crouch beside breach blocks. The intercom crackles. "Target! Enemy battleship, range 8,000. Stand by to commence fire." Seconds stretch. The ship turns gently to port, exposing her full broadside. At WWII 48 hours, Admiral Lee gives the word. Open fire. 9 16-inch rifles erupt in unison, their concussion flattening the sea. The ship lurches sideways under the shockwave. Hot wind surges across the decks. The orange flare illuminates the water for miles. And for the first time that night, Washington reveals herself to the enemy. Her first salvo straddles Kirishima. The second walks in. By the third, she is locked. Shells weighing over a ton each smash through Kirishima's upper works. Fire control towers disintegrate. Forward turrets fall silent. Within minutes, radar confirms catastrophic hits. The Japanese flagship is burning from stem to stern. Below deck, the air grows thick with the smell of ozone and cordite. Gunners shout numbers over the intercom. "Range steady, target speed dropping." The fire control officer nods. "Maintain fire." Lee's voice remains calm. "Keep her centered, don't lose lock." Washington's secondary batteries, 5-inch dual-purpose guns, join in, firing at destroyers trying desperately to close range for torpedo attack. The ship becomes a fortress of thunder. Every muzzle flash lights the ocean like lightning over black water. The Japanese, stunned, return fire blindly. Their shells splash hundreds of yards short. Radar tracks their erratic movements, Kirishima turning in slow, uncontrolled circles. Within 15 minutes, Washington has fired 75 16-inch shells and more than 100 5-inch rounds. Most find their mark. At 01 hours, Kirishima's fate is sealed. Her steering is gone. Her engine rooms flood. Flames burst through open hatches. Admiral Kondo, realizing the battle is lost, orders withdrawal. His cruisers scatter north, pursued by American radar bearings that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Yet Washington does not chase. Admiral Lee holds her steady, cautious of unseen torpedoes and the fragile calm that follows victory. "We've done enough," he tells his bridge crew. "Let them go." For nearly half an hour, Washington remains in control of Iron Bottom Sound, her radar the only vision in a sea of smoke. The surviving American destroyers drift, burning or crippled. The radio silence breaks only once as South Dakota, battered but afloat, signals her survival. Above, the stars return. The guns cool. The echo of battle fades into the wind. The men aboard Washington are exhausted, deafened, half-dazed. But they know what they've done. For the first time in the Pacific War, An American battleship has defeated a Japanese one in direct combat. No fanfare, no trumpet calls. Just the slow awareness that the impossible has been achieved. Below decks, medics move quietly through dim corridors, tending to a handful of wounded. There are no cheers, only silence, heavy and sacred. On the horizon, Kirishima burns brighter. Her crew struggles to save her, but her bow is already down by the head, her engines dead. By dawn, she will capsize and sink, taking over 200 sailors. With her, including many who had once fought at Pearl Harbor. At or 1:40, Admiral Lee gives his final order for the night. Ceasefire, turn south, regroup. Washington turns away slowly, her wake glowing faintly in the phosphorescent water. Her guns, still warm, rest motionless. Behind her, iron bottom. Sound returns to darkness. Quiet now, except for the faint crackle of burning oil. The battle is over, but what it revealed about leadership, technology, and the end of one naval era had only begun to be understood. Climax, turning point. Part 2 by IO2, source hours. The sea had turned strangely calm. Smoke drifted across Iron Bottom Sound in long, oily ribbons. The thunder that had shaken the night was gone, replaced by the faint hiss of steam venting from shattered hulls. From Washington's bridge, the burning remains of Kirishima glowed dimly on the northern horizon. Radar still painted her silhouette, barely moving, listing to port. Lee's operations officer plotted her last position, marking it in pencil with a single note. Dead in the water. The silence on the bridge was profound. Officers spoke in low tones, their faces ghosted by the pale light of radar screens. They all knew what they had witnessed, something no Navy had seen before. A battleship duel fought, won and survived entirely through instruments. In the engine rooms below, men worked shirtless in the swelter, checking bearings and pumps, ensuring the turbines stayed alive. Washington had come through unscathed. No major hits, no damage worth reporting. The armor that could shrug off 16-inch shells had never even been tested. She had struck perfectly and vanished without a scar. Above decks, gunners cleaned barrels still hot enough to glow faintly red. The faint tang of cordite and burnt paint lingered. The ship's chaplain moved quietly through the crew spaces, saying little. No one celebrated. The mood was reverent, almost somber. They had witnessed a slaughter. Out there, beyond the edge of radar range, hundreds of men were dying in the dark. Japanese sailors trapped inside the capsizing Kirishima, their shouts faint across the waves. No one aboard Washington cheered their fate. They simply watched as the burning hulk slowly faded from radar, swallowed by the sea she had once ruled. By 03 hours, the Japanese withdrew entirely. Kondo's surviving cruisers and destroyers limped north, their torpedo tubes empty, their formation shattered. The operation to destroy Henderson Field had failed utterly. For the first time in months, the Tokyo Express turned back. Admiral Lee ordered Washington to circle southward, guarding South Dakota as dawn approached. Damage reports from the latter ship were grim. Dozens killed, her topside riddled with holes, communication systems crippled. Yet she still floated, her crew stubbornly holding course. At 04 Saturday, Lee sent his after-action signal to Halsey's command. Enemy battleship destroyed. Own losses moderate. Mission complete. It was the kind of terse, understated message that belied the scale of what had just happened. Halsey would later call it the calmest sentence ever to change the Pacific War. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Washington's crew gathered quietly on deck. They could see the faint smoke plumes where Kirishima had gone down. Floating debris, timbers, lifeboats, drifting life jackets, rolled in the current. A few sailors spotted faint movement among them, Japanese survivors clinging to wreckage. There were no rescue orders. The battle area was still dangerous. Submarines could be near. The Americans held their distance, watching in silence as the sea claimed what remained. War, by then, had stripped mercy to the bone. Still, among Washington's men, there was reflection. Many had friends aboard the destroyers Walk and Preston, lost earlier in the night. For them, victory came weighted with grief. One gunner later wrote in his journal, "We didn't feel triumph, just relief, and maybe guilt that we were still here." The battle's intensity had lasted barely 40 minutes, but in that brief window, the old world of surface warfare had ended. Washington's action report, written the next day, read like a scientific paper. No emotion, just range tables, shell patterns, damage assessments. Yet between the lines, history could sense the birth of a new doctrine, one where information, not eyesight, ruled the fight. For Admiral Lee, the success was vindication. His trust in radar had proven absolute. For the U.S. Navy, it was proof that technology and training could overcome even Japan's veteran superiority. And for the Japanese command, it was a revelation that arrived too late. Kirishima's loss shocked Tokyo. In one night, the myth of Japanese invincibility in surface combat collapsed. Their doctrine, built on courage and visibility, had been outmatched by mathematics and electrons. The Imperial Navy would never again commit a battleship to a night engagement against radar-equipped opponents. By sunrise, Washington was already steaming southward, escorting her damaged sister ship out of danger. The sea behind her shimmered with the glow of burning oil. The horizon was gray, silent, empty. In the logbook, the navigator wrote a final line for the date. Departed Iron Bottom Sound. All quiet. No fanfare, no music. Just the hum of turbines and the knowledge that something immense had shifted beneath history's surface. The age of the unseen warrior had begun. As dawn rose over the wreckage-strewn waters, Washington sailed toward a new kind of war, one she had just helped invent. Aftermath. Section 1. When the sun rose over Guadalcanal on November 15, 1942, the airfield still stood. The sound of distant gunfire was gone. In its place came the rumble of American engines and the rhythmic buzz of Marine Wildcats taking off from Henderson Field. For the first time in months, the island was secure, temporarily, but decisively. News of the night's battle spread through the battered ranks of the Cactus Air Force and the exhausted Marines along the perimeter. Few knew the details yet, only that a Japanese battleship had been destroyed offshore and that no bombardment had come. For the men in the mud, that meant survival. At sea, Task Force 64 regrouped. Washington had come through nearly untouched, her paint scorched, but her machinery perfect. South Dakota, though battered and burning, limped south under her own power. The destroyers Walk and Preston were gone, their crews scattered across the dark sea. Benham would be scuttled later that day, her bow blown off. When Admiral Lee sent his battle report to Halsey's flagship, the message was almost clinical. One enemy battleship sunk. Heavy damage inflicted on supporting units. Friendly destroyers lost. South Dakota damaged. But behind those plain words lay the transformation of the Guadalcanal campaign itself. The Japanese had committed their last operational battleship force in the area to a decisive bombardment mission, and failed. The destruction of Kirishima meant that for the first time, the Imperial Navy no longer controlled the night around the island. Over the next few days, American reconnaissance confirmed what Lee already suspected. Japanese supply runs had ceased. Transports still afloat after the previous night's chaos were easy prey for dive bombers from Henderson Field. Out of 11 transports dispatched for the operation, only 4 ever reached shore, most of them beaching themselves under attack to offload what little they could. Thousands of Japanese soldiers drowned, burned, or drifted ashore without ammunition or food. For the Americans, this was the turning point. The victory at sea ensured the survival of the airfield, and with it, the ability to strike by day. Within weeks, Japanese command would abandon any attempt to retake Guadalcanal. The long withdrawal that would bleed their empire dry had begun. In Washington, D.C., the news was met with cautious celebration. Official communique remained sparse. Admiral Halsey's dispatches emphasized collective effort rather than individual glory. But within the Navy's inner circles, one name stood out: USS Washington. Naval analysts studying the battle saw in it something larger than victory. Proof that the new doctrines, radar integration, centralized command in the Combat Information Center, and fire control automation were not theoretical advantages. They were decisive. The reports from Washington's radar team became training models for future fleet actions. At the Bureau of Ordnance, engineers pored over Washington's firing records. Her radar data had been perfect, her fire solutions consistent, her hit rate extraordinary for night engagement. The analysis confirmed what Willis Lee had long argued, that radar, properly employed, rendered traditional optical gunnery obsolete. For Japan, the shock was profound. Tokyo Radio first denied the loss of Kirishima, then quietly stopped mentioning her at all. Naval headquarters, reeling from the combined defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, began to realize that industrial and technological inferiority, not bravery, would determine the war's outcome. In diaries and letters captured later, surviving Japanese officers described the night battle as terrifying beyond understanding. They had seen no enemy. The shells had seemed to fall from nowhere. "We fired at ghosts," one survivor wrote, "and the ghosts killed us." Meanwhile, Washington's crew continued their patrols, maintenance routines, and battle drills as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Admiral Lee, in his final report, praised their discipline, but noted only one line about the outcome. Conduct of all personnel was exemplary under unprecedented conditions. There were no decorations, no public parades. Washington slipped back into fleet anonymity, her name rarely in headlines. The Navy moved on to the next crisis, the next battle, the next island. But in that still November dawn, the course of the Pacific War had quietly, permanently changed, because in one night of precision and silence, a single ship had shown what the future of naval warfare would look like. Aftermath, Section 2. In the weeks after the Battle of Guadalcanal, USS Washington returned to the anchorage at Noumea for replenishment. Her gray hull was streaked with salt and soot, her barrels worn from the thunder they had unleashed. Yet she bore no scars of war. To the sailors who saw her arrive, she looked untouched, an enigma of steel that had gone into chaos and returned immaculate. Admiral Halsey visited her personally. He walked her decks quietly, speaking little, inspecting the gun turrets that had changed the Pacific balance. Later, in a private message to Nimitz, he wrote, "Washington fought magnificently. Lee proved the value of radar beyond question. The ship is a model for future surface engagements, but the world beyond the fleet would hardly notice." The headlines of late 1942 were filled with news of Guadalcanal secured, of marine heroism and carrier battles. The silent duel of battleships in the night remained a technical report, a line in naval communiques too complex for the public imagination. Even within the fleet, Washington's victory was overshadowed by the broader shift toward carrier warfare. As the Pacific Campaign accelerated in 1943, the Navy's eyes turned skyward. Battleships, once symbols of national power, were increasingly relegated to escort duty and shore bombardment. The age of the gun was fading. Still, Washington continued to serve with distinction. She escorted fast carriers through the Gilbert's, Marshall's, and Marianas campaigns, her radar now standard across the fleet. At Kwajalein, she fired her 16-inch guns against shore targets with mechanical precision. At the Philippine Sea, she shielded flat tops from air attack. At Okinawa, she endured kamikaze alarms day after day. But she would never again face an enemy battleship. There were none left to fight. The battle she had mastered, the duel of giants in the dark, had already passed into history. After the war, as the U.S. Navy shrank from its wartime vastness, Washington was decommissioned in 1947 and laid up in reserve at Bayonne, New Jersey. For years she sat in silence, her decks empty, her radar removed, her once feared turrets rusting in the Atlantic air. By the late 1950s, the era she represented was gone entirely. Missiles replaced shells, electronics replaced analog gears. The ocean no longer thundered with the voice of 16-inch guns. In 1961, Washington was sold for scrap, cut apart in a New Jersey shipyard. No museum, no preservation, only memories. It was an unceremonious end for one of the most flawlessly fought ships in naval history. No monument marks her name. No Hollywood film immortalized her. She never carried a president, never became a flagship, never survived as a museum relic like her famous sister, North Carolina. Yet within the archives of the U.S. Navy, her record remains perfect. One major surface engagement. One enemy battleship destroyed. 0 combat damage sustained. A clean, clinical, almost impossible symmetry. Naval historians have since debated why Washington remains so underrated. Some say timing. Her victory came in the shadow of Midway and the coming carrier age. Others say character. Admiral Lee's quiet professionalism lacked the flamboyance of figures like Halsey or Spruance. But perhaps it was something deeper. The nature of her triumph itself. The Washington didn't win through spectacle. She won through precision, patience, and discipline, the qualities that rarely make headlines but define mastery. Her victory didn't roar across the world's radios. It simply rewrote naval doctrine in silence. In Japan, the loss of Kirishima marked the end of surface parity. Never again would the Imperial Navy attempt a major night action with battleships. Instead, it turned fully to defensive attrition. Destroyers, submarines, suicide tactics. The balance had shifted irreversibly, and so the legacy of Washington lived on not in fame, but in influence. Every modern naval command center, every missile-guided engagement, every combat information system traces its lineage to the glow of that red-lit CIC in November 1942, where men learned that victory belonged not to those who saw, but to those who understood. In the end, Washington's story is less about glory than transformation. She was the bridge between eras, the last of the great gunfighters and the first of the digital warriors. The sea remembers her, even if history seldom speaks her name. Reflection. Closure. The Pacific Ocean holds its dead close. Beneath its black depths, steel sleeps in silence, American and Japanese alike. Each wreck a frozen chapter of human will and consequence. Among them lies Kirishima, resting upright on the seafloor of Iron Bottom Sound, her hull still torn by the invisible blows of that November night. Somewhere above that same water, USS Washington once sailed homeward, her decks quiet, her men unaware that they had already passed into legend. History often celebrates what is seen: the carriers at Midway, the Marines at Iwo Jima, the atomic fire that ended it all. But sometimes, the true turning points happen in the dark, unseen and unheard, where technology meets courage and changes the course of war without a single photograph to prove it. Washington's victory was such a moment. In just 30 minutes of radar-guided precision, she ended Japan's mastery of night combat, preserved the foothold at Guadalcanal, and ushered in an era where knowledge and electronics ruled the battlefield. Yet when peace came, she slipped quietly into obscurity, scrapped without ceremony, her name fading from public memory. But her echo endures. In every modern command center lit by digital screens, in every missile cruiser guided by invisible sensors, there is a shadow of Washington's CIC. Those calm men under red light, watching a glowing scope, turning data into destiny. The most underrated battleship of World War II did not earn her legacy through fame or fury. She earned it through understanding of her machines, her moment, and her mission. And perhaps that is the truest kind of immortality, to change the future without needing to be seen. As the camera fades to the dark surface of Iron Bottom Sound, the narration slows. In the silence of that November night, one battleship saw what others could not, and history never saw her again. If stories like this move you, the forgotten moments, the silent victories, the men and machines history almost forgot, then help us keep them alive. Hit subscribe and join us as we uncover more untold chapters of World War II, where courage met innovation, and legends were forged in silence. Leave a comment. What do you think was the most underrated ship of the war? And if you'd stand with those who fought unseen, share this film. so their story is never lost again.